Okay, I'm back. One more time. So I start this guy off. Still painting the wood. Let's just jump to the metal. Oh, yeah, I guess let's talk about one of the tools I touched on. I mentioned earlier, like the freeze tool, which I end up doing right here. Grab this guy and click on it, and it freezes it. Just makes it black. I wish it wasn't, because I feel like that can be a bit distracting, because it's like, it's a super stark value. There's no hue and there's no saturation. So anything next to it looks super bland, right? Like desaturated colors look really bright even though they're really dark. Look how dark my color is, right? I know I'm painting kind of light right now, but dude, it ain't black. So there's a pretty distinct difference between those two colors. But it's nice because, you know, it's frozen. I'm just trying to paint in the AO a bit more between those, define these planes a bit more. You can unfreeze things by control clicking on it again. So when it's a selected, control click it. Try to define the AO a bit more around this, kind of the same concept as last time. I tried to paint out some of this mess up here. I was playing around with a lot of the strokes earlier, and I can't remember what I'd end up deciding on, but I think I tried to even this out a bit because, yeah, I do. Because even though I may have come up with an idea, I don't think I ended up liking it anyway, but let's say I did like it. Either you have to do it all or nothing, right? Either all the ends of my wood have this like weird little highlighting effect going on, or I just take care of it, and that's the end of it. So for this guy in the front, the wheel, I had to bring it into Photoshop because it's too crammed, and I'm actually doing the layers themselves. And this is a nice piece to do it on just because, what was I going to say? It's a nice piece to do it on just because it's all one consistent mesh. You know, I don't have to worry about like, oh, it's a broken mesh. I got to continue like this over the seam and stuff. Nah, it's really easy to paint on. And then I tried to like catch the light just a little bit more on, I think, these areas, I believe. No, it was up because the light's still coming down from on top, right? So I know I didn't do it right here, but if you have the time to do it or you want to, it's a bit nicer if you can try and like still work with your directionality in your light. And even though it's a highlight, make this more intense and this slightly lighter, right? And then like even inverse your highlights around a little bit. This is starting to like kind of do an angle turn. It's turning a corner, so to speak. And you want to make sure that it's like flipping that highlight over it because it's starting to do like a loop-de-loop. That's really nice though. I like how that turned out. I think at this point I tried like adding some AO to the wheel. Um, nah, I just froze that. Oh yeah, I'm painting the metal. Here we go. So, how am I gonna talk about this? Um, Metal is definitely something you want to work from mid mid dark ranges to pretty dark ranges. This is, I think, definitely like a style, like definitely a stylization of what metal is, but metal doesn't have a lot of bright points in it. It has a lot of really sharp bright points depending on the roughness of the metal, right? Metal that's super shiny literally has like pinpoint lights on it. Like if this thing was 100% chrome, this would be a mirror. It would reflect the environment, but it's not. But um, it definitely is reflecting mainly dark colors because I'm in a dark environment, and I'm also trying to catch some of those edge highlights. So you want to try and push those darker values on all spots. And then again, with the whole concept of working from darker to lighter, it's definitely a lot easier to start dark and then add those highlights in. Your direct highlights usually don't want to be uh, terribly saturated. In this case, I did more of a moonlight color, so I did like this like aqua. And then I think the final result ended up looking really dope because it's like that really intense color pop on here. Because the wheelbarrow was so orangey and kind of reddish to begin with, that the blue ends up really kicking off of it, which I think is tight. It ends up looking a bit more like silver, but that's okay. I like it, and that's all that matters. Is I'm happy with it, and it looks super exaggerated. Um, but usually, what I'll do is I'll paint on like the highlighted areas. I'll paint it like I'm just painting like a flat, not flat. I'm sorry, a rough material, and then so I'll paint in my highlights and the things that face up, and then with metal, I'll go in and actually add some of these little like little dark spots to kind of give it that hammered metal feel. Um, you can kind of call it like a World of Warcraft look to it too. Definitely take a ton of reference from WoW, like any other hand painter out there, but I don't really do it as much anymore, just because I think I'm trying to separate it just a little bit from WoW, but I think eventually I I paint in like a really nice bright highlight on it, but I ditch it because I kind of think of it like that really classic like shing, like when a highlight like passes over the top of like an animation. A lot of pixel art does that. Or like when you get a new item, and it's like, oh look, you got it, and it does like that really cool like light pass. And yeah, this I feel like my sound effect was the thing that sold it. Like shing. um, anyway, adding some AO to this makes it look the bolts are more like solidified into this. And actually open up the UV editor on here. I don't use this a whole lot, but it's kind of nice for when you're working in an editor. Um, Rather than trying to carve this out, what I'll do is I'll just draw like the general shape, and it's one of those things where it's really precise, so it's actually easier just to carve it instead. Like you make a big blob, and then you carve out the shapes from there. So I'll come in with a really small one, and then I kind of chisel out that like pentagon shape. A little tip that I found out is that I find that I got a burp. Sorry, hold on. Excuse me. I'm drinking a lot of soda right now. I apologize. Anyway, what I was trying to say is I find that when you're working with like bolts, you or like low poly rounded objects, let's say that, you kind of want to embrace the low poly aspect of it and make it a part of it, if that makes sense. Like y'all, if you're trying to like make a circle like bolt, either you paint it in as a circle or you make it like 20 around, like 12 or 16, a 12 or 16 sided cylinder that's capped off, and that's fine. But then it like really clumps up your detail, um, and it just I don't know, it doesn't really feel worth it to me. So I would embrace the low poly and then make it a part of your design, right? And I think like these like 5-sided bolts look really freaking tight because the shape language just looks cool. Um, I noticed a lot of stylized artists are doing that lately, so I started kind of followed suit on accident. Um, Try to add in some rust, ends up looking like rusty pimples, which is gross. So I ended up ditching some of it. But I like the red. When you're working with metal, depending on the environment, I know tin tends to be a bit more browny, but a lot of them tend to err on the side of blue. So when you're doing like metal, red like maroons look really dope. Be careful when you try to accent your like or you do your complementary colors, right? I think this looks pretty cool, but adding this streak just totally ruined it. I think I ended up washing it out later. I can't remember, but anyway, what I was saying though is be like you're gonna add like a complementary color as part of a hue shift. Do it in the darker areas because again, darker usually equals desaturated because you don't want to have dark saturated colors. You can just use them sparingly, and when you do have a dark and desaturated color, it allows you to continue that conversation around the color wheel and then bring in some darker tones and then like a deep maroon. Oh, it looks so nice, dude. It looks gorgeous. Usually deep purple, maroon, or blue is like the color for shadowed areas because it's so cool toned, right? And we want to be cool, baby. I want to fix this too. I don't know if I'm gonna do a video on this. I might do like a wrap up video. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. But what I'd like to do is I want to fix the rotation of these. They're not like all the same. I try to break it up because it's like, hey, you want to like rotate things around, and so that way they don't just look like they're duplicated and stamped. Because my pet peeve when people work with duped meshes is they don't rotate them, they don't wiggle them, they don't scale them, they don't like pull some of the verts around to break it up. When you guys are stacking like 15 UVs on top of each other, please, please, please make sure you're trying to like break it up a bit more. But be careful you don't pull a me here and you don't like stick the dark thing on top and the dark part or the bright part on the bottom. Um, I actually am okay with it here a little bit just because it's only tilted like 30 degrees, but that on the other side was awful. So this is the part that probably had the most exaggeration on the whole piece. This part annoyed me when I was painting or when I was doing this so much diffuse because I was like, God damn it! Like I definitely want like that metal pop because I love the way this turned out right here. I think this looks so freaking cool, and that's just I don't know. I like that. And painting metal, even though it can be challenging, is one of the more enjoyable things in my opinion to paint because it's got so much color, it's got a lot of contrast in it, and it's one of those things that I think if done right, or even if you have the slightest grasp on like what makes metal, it like you can have so much fun with it. And This all just points down. There's no highlights. So I said screw them, and I'm gonna do it anyway. So that's what I'm doing right here. Is I'm painting in these little highlights, and even though this is still technically angled down, and you're not gonna get a catch from it, I don't care. And it also, when you paint this, it makes it appear as if it's like kind of bowed inward, like it's got a bit of a curvature to it. I'm flipping it around, making sure it's reading okay from both sides, because when you're mirroring UVs and you're flipping things around and you have stacked UVs, you want to make sure that things are still reading okay from all angles, right? So you want to pick a neutral angle or a neutral paint job that makes the most sense. If they're conflicting at the end of the day, you can always modify them later on inside of your modeling engine, whether it's like Maya or Blender or whatever, and you can move stuff around to make it work. But it's okay at the end of the day. I think I flipped it around and it looked good to me, so I kept it. Metal is also a good time to try and get your plane changes here. Like, think about how like one particular angle might catch a ton of highlight or sheen to it, and like that's what I'm going for. This little lip, it's like it just caught a whole blast of moonlight, which I think is just so dope. Um, so yeah, fast forward a bit. Oh, here you go. So I kind of pop this a bit more, and then with metal, what I like to do to simulate edge wear is usually when you have like scratched up metal pieces, you have like these little like doodads and these little dents in it. If you just kind of like grab your pen and you just like trace a line, but you kind of do like a dot dot pattern, where it's like doot 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 doot, and like randomly drop like strokes on it. You get this little like, it's like catching glimpses or little glints of the metal, right? And it just looks like it's pretty neat and torn up. I like that. You want to be careful though, depending on what you're trying to define. This is kind of where I started to bring in some of my particular stroke style. Um, it's always weird talking about your own style because everybody's got their own thing, and I feel like I finally started to find mine, even though I didn't do it in this piece, which I find funny. I do this kind of like back and forth pattern, where I'll like do like an X shape. I was doing that down here. That's like my favorite thing. I think that gives you a lot of information, and it just looks like cool and painted. Um, what I do right here is, even though this is barely bent, I wanted it to read as if it was at the exact same angle, right? And that's a good way to help determine your colors with the help of so much diffuse and then kind of analyzing your mesh. So much diffuse already simulates color the way it needs to. It's basically perfect, for better or worse, right? Or for lack of a better term. So what you can do is, you're like, okay, I'm confused. What should I paint like one of my angles? In my head, I went, okay, this to me is the same angle as that, or I want it to read as the same angle as that. So pick a color and then paint that on there, right? Because that implies this is the same. This is like the same angle, and so I know it doesn't seem like much, but actually you may have noticed I'm a bit more quick and sloppy with my strokes. But this, again, I wasn't right here because, again, going to the whole thing about clean angles, you want to really make sure you're defining those angles and taking the time to do so, because sloppy angle changes are no bueno. So definitely avoid that. And then actually grab some of this and bring it back down again. So, oh man, those look so fucking cool to me. Because I know the super bright color's facing up. This is down, and this is like outward, right? So that's a really, really clean read in my opinion. And then I go in and I modify it a little bit and add some color, and always, always, always color grabbing off of what you already have. Don't go up here and start searching for any colors unless you're confident with it, or unless you've already color grabbed initially. Because the second you try soul searching, unless you're like the god of color, or you've been doing this for a long time, or you have the most insane confidence, you're probably going to grab the wrong color. Um, so don't trust yourself so much. Trust nobody. But no, real talk. Like, just grab colors. It'll save you so much more time. That was one of the first newbie things I stomped out. Was like, I'm done trying to find colors from scratch. I mean, shit. Even go and get a palette generator. Nothing wrong with that either. But again, because so much diffuse slaps, it's like all you have to do is basically feed in like three of your main colors. It does the rest for you. It creates the gradients for you. It does all that jazz. All you have to do is slide some dials around. It creates a nice base, and then you already have your base. You already have your hue set up, all that stuff, and you're just good to go from there. I decided to mute this section a bit, like I said, because it looked like rusty pimples to me. If you do rust, make sure you're consistent with it. Consistent in the sense that not only one random object has rust, but like you carry it throughout your piece. I think that's like really important. I mean, use logic, of course. Not everything's just going to be covered in rust, but it's like, I mean, in my artistic opinion, I think you should totally just like grab certain colors and then, or grab the rust color and put it in one or two more spots. I don't know what the art principle is, but think of it like everybody needs a friend, right? Like you need to have the rust needs to have a friend, and the metal needs to have a friend. Like you should never just have like one random one-off thing on here unless it's like it stands really well on its own. Um, it's always funny giving tips like this because I feel like I don't follow these all on myself, but I think it's something to keep in mind always because you want to try and train your mind to like think a particular way when painting. So another shout out because I just can't stop shouting people out because I want to thank people for the skill set that I have. Hand Painters Guild. There's a dude in there. I think his name is Mike. He was on a call with me like 2 years ago, and I actually finally had like mustered up the courage to go online and do a talk with people because I got bad anxiety with that. And he talked to me about plane changes when I was working on this like singing fish that I have in Coffin Rot. Um, and ever since then I've like only thought that way. It's hard to always work on that, but dude, like you saved my butt, so thank you for that. And other point is that they're a super great resource. I haven't really been super active in the community lately because again I haven't really done hand painting, but if you guys are trying to learn, whether you're coming from a different background or you're just getting into 3D or what, they're super well structured. They're not going to put you down. They're not assholes. They're good people. There's industry professionals in there. Like it is as legit as it gets. So please check out Hand Painters Guild. Um, Stylized Station also has some stuff. They're a bit more PBR focused, but they're pretty solid as well. I definitely would prefer, if you're doing hand painting, I would definitely stick with Hand Painters Guild, though, for sure. They also have a guild Pinterest, too, which is nice. Um, Grabbing some more color here to try and match those up. All I'm doing is hue shifting again, so it's pretty cool. Um, Also, I kind of like the color combo here because it made me feel like it was more ghostly. Like I was going for like a ghostly metal because, ooh, we're in a graveyard. So it's spooky, right? Kind of kept that going. I think I decided to end up like painting this stuff right here in the UV editor. Yeah, when you're working in like really cramped areas like this, definitely start using the freeze tool. Super nice. I realize that this is kind of facing out a bit, so I feel like it might pick up a little bit of like that brightness. But again, I want to focus on defining the planes a bit more because I find that to be higher in importance, in my opinion, than some other people might find it. So I decided to kind of err on the side of making this darker anyway, and then defining the planes a bit more on the top rather than making it seem a bit more accurate. Um, oh yeah, I went in here and I ended up. Oh god, I had to fix up like this little area down here. Yeah, this was way too cramped to get in on, so I decided to take it into Photoshop. This was an interesting thing to paint because again, this is part of the rotating wheel, right? So I want to make sure I'm not painting it as if it's only going to be sitting in one position, but on the flip side, you want to paint it so there's other planes. This one was a tough one though because only six there are only 6 phases on it, so it's like, oh god, what do I do? So I think I decided to just do like two dark ones that are both surrounded by light. So it goes like like a mid-tone light color, maybe like around here-ish. Um, these are really dark, and then a mid-tone, really dark mid-tone, and then I painted some highlights in between them. So I wanted to try and make it new. So I neutralized it first, even though that's like again kind of one of the no-nos of hand painting is you don't want to like walk away with a final neutral paint job unless you're doing PBR. But when I say neutral, again I mean like mid-tone, kind of flat, no contrast. But I did that just so I can kind of have an even playing field, and then I can go in and I can also paint. Painted in some AO, like just some quick dark lines really fast. Yeah, it's kind of where I started defining it. So I I was flipping back and forth to kind of see it in 3D because I find that switching spaces helps visualize a bit more, and you want to see it on the final product anyway. So I think that looks pretty good. Gonna keep going. Realize the AO needs to be pushed a bit more here anyway. Can't remember what. Yeah. Um, Keep going with the stuff right here. I just totally spaced out in the middle of my voice recording. That's funny. um, but yeah, I mean, there's not much else to talk about anyway, so I've just kind of been rambling for the sake of talking. I think I gotta take it over to the next pieces of metal, but I find that it's probably a bit easier to do in 3D space at this point. Oh yeah, I gotta define this a bit, obviously, but I figured it was easier just to freeze it and work in here. Just flipping it around. Kind of trying to define this a bit more. This one I ended up going with being like it being defined just a little bit with it. Like, okay, sorry, I'm mumbling this the wrong way. I was okay with kind of painting it as if it was just coming from one direction because it's so big, and most of these sides are pretty neutral that the odds of you ending up with that on top is like slim to none. So, and besides, this is not really all that dark. 'Cause remember, my dark metal is this color and this color. Comparably, they're not. They're it's pretty bright still. So it still gives this part of the wheel some definition, like some directionality, I guess. Um, but still also keeps it pretty neutral in all lighting and all like scenarios where it's spun around. Kind of pushing the AO a bit so I can help divide the elements here. They're just right now it just looks like it's just a color shift, and that's no good. You want to make sure it feels as if it's like a separation of elements. In this case, there's metal clamped to the top of this wooden wheel. So this is where I started kind of painting in some of those highlights I was talking about. Um, I just kind of picked like random points. Actually, picked a lot of the points that seem to come to a point. My whole joke with this thing is it's like I imagine you have this like wheelbarrow that has like a non-uniform circular wheel. So it's like because you're like the whole lore of Coffin Rod is like your dad just this jackass and like he owns a bar and he's just it's just not good at all and he everything he thinks is functioning and is good just isn't. So I feel like that kind of added the whole like meme of him being like, "Oh son, look at my wheel." It's really really good, but it's actually just this like awful non-circular thing. um, so I feel like catching the like having the glints of metal on the edges of those like non-uniform parts or the parts that like are kind of sharp and have a really like abrupt corner change. I feel like uh, that was a good spot to highlight, so I kind of did that. So I had to go back because I forgot to do this part of the wood. You guys have seen me paint wood for like an hour or so. Doing final touch-ups. Again, I'm sure plenty of you can see a ton of issues, and looking back at it already, I can paint over this again. But you need to get in the habit of calling things done, and I think for what it's worth, coming from start to finish for this prop and recording the footage for over the course of 6 to 8 hours was pretty good. Um, oh yeah. Okay, so one last general tip is I do a final value pass where I'm like, hey, you got to darken this stuff up. So I'm coming in here. I'm fixing up some last minute things that help define some of the things a bit more. The things that help define some of the meshes and their angles and their directionality and where they exist in relation to the light. Just a really final touch up. And what I do is I do a multiply layer. Oh, I'm sorry. Go back. I do a multiply layer, and because multiply adds darkness on top, anything that's not 0, 0, 0 is gonna add a value. Okay, it's gonna add darkness to it. So if you're trying to do minimal amounts of value shifting, with a multiply, you want to try and go almost white. And the same thing is for screens, except opposite, because screening, you're going to take, it's just adding, like, or you're basically, yeah, you're basically just adding on top of all the RGB values. You're adding on numbers. So if you're screening with white, it's gonna get blown out like literally instantly. So if you're screening, you want to go almost black. But I do a tinge of purple just because that's kind of how I like to do my AO. Because AO looks stupid if it's like just harsh black. Um, Same with any shadows. So that's kind of what I do with that. I think I ended up calling it here. I just wanted to do a quick little swoopy do on here. I did it a bit of a softer brush too. And for my final pass, I will do a thing. Oh shit! I'm doing a saturation pass. Right on. Saturation doesn't matter what color you're doing. Think of it like it's still like an alpha layer, meaning it's like only uses like one set of values from 0 to 255, but instead think of it like on its side. So instead of going from black to white, pretend like your saturation level is black to white. It doesn't care about hue. You can do it in purple, you can do it in green, you can do it in red. It doesn't matter. All it's going to do is either increase or decrease saturation. The more saturated you are in that particular hue, the more saturated that spot's going to be. Decided to push the orange just a little bit more here though, because I feel like we could still use some more color. Because always last minute, you want to do those little corrections you've been trying to tell yourself the whole time. I've been like, hey, I want to do this really desaturated, nasty wood, but it doesn't matter what I said with that, because the reality is it's not going to look that good because it's desaturated and muted. And guess what? All of Coffin Rod is sad and drab and desaturated and muted. So it's like, dude, you don't want to always like stick 100% to the plan. I think I realized last minute that there just needs to be a bit of life to it. So pretty gross though. So usually when I'm working with saturation, I pick like right around here-ish for what I'm gonna do, and then I just dial in the levels. Really subtle though, you guys. Saturation shifting shouldn't be that clear. And then I went and did some subtle pops on it too. So what I'll do is, I'll do like the parts that are most important to the eye. Those will be like the most saturated. And then the parts that are transitioning to the dark areas, which are usually desaturated and like a bit more on the cooler side, I'll just like grab a lot. I'll actually grab a little bit less of saturation, then I'll actually just dab in some like totally gray, because it actually just flattens out the saturation altogether. So it exaggerates that slide from desaturated all the way up to saturated, essentially. God, I think I said saturation like 500 times in the last 2 minutes, so I'm sorry. Still doing some final touches, and then this is where I'm going to do my last little push here. So this is the final touch up. So I bring it in, Control Alt Shift E, which makes a new layer, and it grabs everything you're looking at and it just shoves it on as a flat baked layer. And this is where I do like my final round of touch ups. So what I'll do is I'll do a little bit of contrast just for good measure. Bump up the saturation just a slight bit, and then I get the backwards. So yeah, saturation, then the contrast. I don't do, notice I'm not doing effects. I don't care. This is another non-destructive way to do it, because what I did is I took everything and I just slapped it onto one layer. So if I'm like, ew, that looks like shit, guess what I do? I hide this layer, I do Control Alt Shift E again, make another layer, and I just make a huge stack of these, right? And then I can compare like what edits do what things to them. I've been better about working with, saturation and values and hues a bit. I've been better with it lately because of so much diffuse, but back in the day when I was pretty bad with it, I would actually heavily rely on a final pass of saturation or contrast, right? Like, it's okay to be weak in an area and then just compensate for it with some kind of filter or layer effect later on, right? So don't beat yourself up too much. And definitely do it if it's lacking in one of those particular areas. But again, because I've gotten better, I don't need to as much anymore, but it's still nice to like bring out just a little bit more. And usually anytime I bump up the saturation, I'm like, ooh, this is pretty. So I tend to leave it like that. One final thing you can do is you can actually sharpen it. Fanny Vern did a tutorial. I'm sure all of you guys know who Fanny Vern is. And she's like, hey, I like to do this thing called sharpen, sharpen. And it just really like crunchies up. Like it makes everything really crunchy and like, well, sharp. Crazy, right? It looks dope, but when you're painting with so much diffuse and you're not painting it from scratch, it already does a really good job of having really sharp tones anyway. I know one of my issues when I was painting, when I first started, is I painted really soft, and I still kind of do. Um, but when I would paint from scratch altogether, I would use really, like, everything would still look pretty soft, even though I used hard brushes. So the sharpness really brought out those brush strokes for me, right? So again, it's just a really nice, friendly helper at the end of the time. At the end of the day, when you're done with your piece, you want to do like 2 last-minute things to like really, really push it to its final state. Um, but in this case, with using so much diffuse, which is kind of what this tutorial is about, it's usually not necessary. So I'm gonna say try to avoid it when you're doing so much diffuse. Um, at this point, I'm like super happy with it. So like that's it. I was gonna do a turntable later on, but like I'm really happy with this. So that's it, man. I'm gonna I'm just gonna do the export really quick. What I do is I bring it into Photoshop and I just hit Control Alt Shift, change it to PNG, and that's it. That's the end of it. Um, but yeah, dude, like this was the tutorial. It only took me like a ton of time to get here, but yeah. Thanks for watching this. I hope you guys got something out of it. Um, this was a ton of fun to do. I really enjoy getting to teach people, and I know I can ramble a lot, but it gives me a platform to talk about like positive positive attitudes for when painting, or positive attitudes when doing 3D art, or talking about things that not a lot of people get to talk about, or usually not it's not seen on Twitter or these like Discord groups, or gives me a good chance to talk about my process and what I do and how I approach it. And it's just really cool because I get to contribute to this like whole community of hand painted stuff and just awesome kick ass art. So I hope you found my ways pretty helpful. And if you didn't, cool, that's fine too. You know, there's like another way you can do it then. And um, I will maybe see you in future videos. See ya. Yeah.